Okay.
Hello, welcome to the inaugural Information Innovation at UTS virtual discussion. I'm very pleased to be joined by two fantastic guests. I'm Matt Moore, I'm an industry fellow here at UTS, and I'm co-convener of the seminar series. My two guests are Josie Gibson, who is a former journalist fascinated by how so few people pull off complex stuff and most others fail. She now runs a group of unique change makers, the Catalyst Network, coaches and mentors executives and would-be leaders, and works on the occasional mega project to keep herself grounded in real work life. Our second discussant is Richard Claydon. Richard's work examines ironic management and organizational misbehavior. He is the CEO of Round Pegs, a community of disruptive thinkers and rebel talents helping leaders and companies better manage the turbulence and cope with the black swans of the contemporary business environment. He is a herder of black swans. He teaches the leadership module from Macquarie Business School's Global MBA program. So first of all, Josie and Richard, thank you very much for joining me here this evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
And so our topic is kind of organizational culture and change. And we've kind of kicked around a few questions. And I think the first one I would like to start with is, so for the two of you, what are the biggest myths about organizational culture that you have encountered?
Ladies first, please.
Ladies first.
Over to you, Josie.
The simple fact that you can set out to create a culture, I think, is one of the biggest myths that I've encountered. And the definition of culture that that really resonates for me is Jason Fried, the founder of Ruby on Rails, where he said, you don't set out to create a culture. It's a set of behaviors that produces a culture. So I think we've actually been caught in this vortex of culture talk for many years, focusing on the wrong things. And I'm going to throw to Richard on that because I know he's very passionate about this.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, that's the way that I would differentiate between the sort of the myth versus the reality is the myth is that a culture is something that a company has, and the reality is it's something that the company is. So the idea that it's something that's designed and imposed upon the culture by top management. Something that it is it's much more of an open source set of behaviors that are coming in from everywhere and dynamically changes as the world sort of unfolds in front of you. So you've got all these different people who are contributing to the culture across organization, interpreting reality very differently, and it comes together in a larger whole. So academically, you would sort of say that Harvard Business School and Stanford Business School were the organization or the institutions that developed the has model, and that perhaps MIT is the is model. So that's I think MIT is much more accurate in examining what culture is.
Yeah, I think you really raise an important point there. Just talking about the culture is a bit of a myth because it's so incredibly complex and tribal and full of subcultures, and this leads to a focus on something that doesn't actually exist. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to I think even the complexity, if you look at the thinking about culture historically, it really came out of a combination of Japanese, Scandinavian, and American influences. So you've got this idea of deep loyalty and trust from the Japanese. You've got the Scandinavian participatory decision making, and you've got this rugged American individualism, and it's all been packaged together. You say, oh, this is what corporate culture looks like. This is what a great corporate culture is, but it's got these three different elements coming in and informing it, which are coming from other cultural forms.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to sneak in because I'm loving what's being said. And I think the comment about there's a myth that culture is a thing that you make, right? Is for me summing up what the two of you have just said. Right? And part of me thinks about the history of corporations, right? Like the railroad corporations, the automobile corporations, and these were institutions founded primarily by engineers, like by mechanical engineers, structural engineers, and in that discipline, you do make things, right? So part of me wonders if, as people start creating organisations, they come through with a particular mindset, and for some people, that is very much an engineering mindset. So of course, culture is something that you make because you make everything.
Yeah. My favourite book on culture is called Engineering Culture, which is a deep critique of that very assumption that it's something that you can make and impose on people, and rather than it's something that's more dynamic. So yes, and I think there's another one called Designer Cells, which talks about the same thing. So you have the design on one hand and you have the engineering on the other hand, and they're both deep critiques on exactly that point.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, and as someone who's worked with engineers quite a bit, it's a really interesting point that you make. I come back to what I said before, though, that culture is actually an outcome from a set of behaviours over time. So maybe it's a bit of a semantic exercise to talk about making it, but you certainly create the settings. You make decisions about the settings that produce that culture. So in a sense, you do make it, but you can't control it.
Which would be very familiar to somebody that works in agriculture, right? Because you don't make plants.
Yeah.
So I think that's all really great. What's another myth? Hit me with another myth, people.
Well, my favourite one is that culture drives performance. So the halo effect is a fantastic examination of the idea that high-performing organisations say they have a great culture. So it's the performance that comes before the culture rather than the other way around. So it's the stories about being in a high-performing organisation which results in stories about a great culture. So you have all this bias that you can't escape from when you're talking about the organisation. And so the means get confused with the ends. Lots of organisations think, well, if we create a great culture, then we're going to get great performance, rather than looking at what great performance looks like and then having a great culture coming out of ongoing meaningful performance.
Another one that I would, that I've thought about a lot over the years is that culture is basically set by the leadership team, or depending on the tribe that you happen to be talking to, that is, it's driven by the grassroots. And my experience is it's one of the most complex dances of different levels of the organisation that actually produces the culture. And yes, the leadership team in any organisation obviously has a prime role in establishing those settings that we talked about. But there are a whole lot of factors that go into driving the sort of behaviours that produce a culture. And to just focus on one level and ignore the rest, I think there's a sort of simplistic notion that if you just pick one and you fund it or do it or tick it off, voila, you get the culture that you want.
Yeah, I would argue, I think Edgar Schein, in one of his more recent talks, talked a little bit about the idea of what I'm calling single interest or concept cultures. So the idea is you take something called safety, and then around safety, you create a culture, rather than you look at all of the behaviours that are appearing and you sort of try and nudge them specifically. You can't just create a culture from that initial concept, because it's not dynamic enough. It's not actually how people are behaving. It's just a set of ideas. It's culture requires behaviours and group behaviours. It's a social dynamic, not a top-down engineered concept that can be applied.
And you raised something that really drives me nuts, actually. The focus on skilling and skills, as opposed to the sort of mindset shifts that we need when we're talking about building groups of people who can work better together, who can adapt. We're talking about very deep mindset shifts that have to take place, not simply, plugging someone into a skills training program. And to do this is incredibly complex work. I mean, there's decades, Richard, this is your territory, but there are many decades of research that show just how complex it is. Shifting individuals, thoughts, beliefs, assumptions, and then sort of extrapolating that across a collective is incredibly difficult, complex work. And yet so much of the money goes to skills, which is sort of, to me, window dressing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, behaviour before skills, defining what behavioural training looks like is hard enough in itself.
Yeah.
Because it looks. I mean, having done a fair bit of it with groups, it looks from the outside incredibly messy and almost chaotic, and people go, "Oh, well, that doesn't look right." So I'm going to run scared from that. But out of that complexity and out of that mess come the interesting ideas around behaviours that need to potentially be implemented. And that's the challenge: is you don't come in and pose it externally. You have these conversations internally and work out what's already been done and how people are already thinking, and that's what you turn into the behaviours that need to that are already working largely, but perhaps they're not working enough, or the behaviours that are causing dysfunction and you need to actually start stopping. But they only come out of the conversations that you have in these sort of semi-chaotic behavioural meetings.
So I'm going to invite both of you to kind of give an example of that, if you can, because I'm conscious as we talk about this, we can talk about things in an abstract manner. And every so often I would like to kind of ground us again, and then we can go back into the abstract. So does that sound okay?
Yep.
We'll always try, yeah.
Let's give it a go. So who wants to go first?
So I do work in the project sphere, and what I find really interesting is coming back to what we're talking about. What is rewarded behaviour? Because every sort of every collective has these norms, and in the project world, what is collaboration is not, in my experience, it's rarely rewarded to the extent that it needs to be, or even recognised. Because it takes time and it costs money. Because one of the recurring themes that I hear as I talk to people, regardless of the sector, is we need to get people to collaborate more. And I come from a media background, live radio. You are paid to collaborate, essentially. So the model's very different. And what I see in projects is people who actually have the appetite and the aptitude to spend more time, because to me, collaboration is relational and it's around delivering outcomes, usually in a high pressure environment. But if that is not acknowledged and rewarded, and the system's not set up to support that, then people won't do it. And I see that happening time and again, that it's not that people don't actually want to do it. They're not encouraged to do it. They're not rewarded to do it.
How about yourself, Richard?
Yeah, I'm going to be very careful trying not to mention company names here.
Of course.
But, because there was...
Discretion is required.
Yes. So there was a company that I've done some work for that was taken over by another company. Now, the one that I was working for was trying to work on this behavioural model. Now, it had multiple locations and different frontline teams in all of these locations. And we were working on something that I would call contextual scaling. So that each of these locations had a different clientele. So one location might have had a clientele that was maybe from the financial district, and another one it was artistic, and another one it was a bit more startup-y and technological. And because they had different desires, the frontline team, their job was to have these relationships with the clientele and collaborate around what created value for that specific group of people. Now if what worked in the financial district didn't necessarily work in the startup-y technical one, and didn't necessarily work in the artistic one. But so they constantly had to take ownership of what works for our people, and how do we experiment with it, and how do we dampen it back down again. So it worked absolutely fabulously. So they all of 3 of the sites had a huge number of clients that continued to come in and use the sites regularly. huge occupancy rates. The company that took over them immediately installed vertical lines of reporting, where the actual company that was in charge, or the people that were in charge of the behaviors, were based in another country with no contextual understanding, let alone of the country these premises were in, but the specific districts that these premises operated in. And within 2 weeks, the problem started, because there was no longer any reward for the collaborative behavior. And also the clientele were no longer getting, they no longer got proactive responses, because it had to go through the whole system and up the verticals before answers happened. So yeah, without naming names, it was a dramatic difference of performance within a very, very short space of time, having spent months working on how do you get it right. It was demolished. I mean, within a fortnight, it started to go wrong.
If I could jump in with a good example that I was involved in some years ago in New Zealand, and I know it's ongoing, very strong commitment in the public sector to change, very complex portfolio of activities. And they spent a lot of time with people at different levels designing and articulating a model for how they wanted to work, and then actually going and doing it and bringing those learnings back. And they were prepared to do it over many years, which is in fact what happened. At the same time, there was a decision to create a transformation program to run alongside to look at the technological issues. And as you can imagine, they weren't always aligned. But what impressed me about the collective work was the extraordinary adaptability and curiosity of people at all levels, and how that actually created this attractor quality right throughout the organization. You know, people who didn't ordinarily cross paths, actually, because of the way they designed the work, started to form relationships. And as a result, you could really noticeably see the culture shifting.
Yeah. I mean, that's what a workshop looks like. I think, in my experience, if you run this kind of workshop well, where you give them an open enough question to start exploring, all of that curiosity and creativity and thinking emerges. The challenge is to get that workshop into the structural processes of the organization. And I've seen it happen, and I mean there are a number of companies worldwide where it does happen, but it's not supported by these vertical models particularly. And unfortunately, and to go back to our topic, these vertical models are very often run by companies who promote their culture as being something incredible and special and collaborative, etc., but they then their processes and systems don't support the kind of behaviors that they want. So I'll give you one example where I can mention the name, because it's not a client, but I've been asked to talk about them previously. If you look at the retail sector in Hong Kong, all of them are trying to implement sort of digital top-down technologies where they drive almost scripted performance at the frontline level, and they do the whole omni-channel kind of, let's get everything across all the same experience across all of the disciplines, all of the marketing channels. Yet the company that's sort of dominating the space that they're trying to compete with is Zara, who spend no money on marketing, hardly any money on the omni-channels. What they do is they create the actual people who run the store are given the opportunity to say, this is what our customers want.
Yeah.
We report it back up through the system, and then the system responds to the experience of the frontline staff. So there's the classic story is the pink scarf story. So a number of Zaras around the world reported within a couple of days that there were people asking for pink scarves and they didn't have any. So it goes up, this information collected from around the system goes up through the system, And suddenly, within another week or so, all the Zaras have the pink scarf range, and they sell out rapidly, because people at all levels get heard. So and again, it's a distributed set of controls. It's not a top-down thing where we're telling you what to do. It's good technology, but it's pulling distributed systems back into the center, which is what I think a good contemporary organizational culture will look like. These people are saying this, these people are saying that, and if we pull it all back into the center, we then can start creating meaning around all of these signals that are coming in.
So what you're talking about to me sounds like, a very adaptive decision-making model that pushes autonomy out, accountability out, but with feedback loops back into the decision-making model. And I think you can get the smell of an organization straight away when you start to ask questions around how they make decisions and who makes decisions, who's allowed to make decisions in an organization. You get a pretty quick read of the vibrancy, the health of the culture.
Yeah, and I think that we can give many examples. We don't have enough time, but there are a lot where, and the kind of cultures that organisations say they have. I think that's the signal that we look for. There are not many of them say that. Not many of them who say they have it actually have it, but the signal is how these frontline staff people start talking about the organisation and how heard they are. It doesn't mean that they're making all the important decisions, but it does mean that they're the sense makers and the sense gatherers and the interpreters that are listened to. And without them being listened to and their interpretation of the organisation being taken seriously, I don't think you have a meaningful culture. You've just got an imposed one. You haven't got a live, dynamic, active one.
Yeah.
Were they hard enough examples, Matt? Or?
They were beautiful examples. Thank you both very much. Look, I think there's a lot of things in terms of what you've just kind of said, and I think so. One question that we kicked around that I really want to kind of touch on, and I think it's come from Josie, is so you were talking about hierarchical organisations, right? So the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion around non-hierarchical organisations, flat organisations. And this kind of goes to some of the things that Josie said about decision making, where organisations that claim to have no managers, this kind of thing, right? So what I would like to hear from you is what you think of these newish organisational forms that we're seeing.
You go first, Richard.
So I would actually argue that this sort of self-organisation, flat structure organisation, the sort of post-industrial form, I think that it's been associated with the Japanization of workforces, and and culture is also part of that. So we have to remember that we didn't talk about organisational culture as a thing until the 1980s. So as we go in, and then it was largely the American sort of Silicon Valley stage one, these big tech companies, the initial tech and engineering companies that bought into this model, and they moved into a much flatter system. So that was the first shift into this flatter system. So I think when we talk about these self-organized models, it's part of a continuum to industrial work, which would be the hierarchical, command and controlled sort of pyramids of leadership and management, to the models that we see now. So I don't think, it's not a new trend. We've been doing this for 40 odd years. Now, we might have sped up because, in a cliche terms, all companies are now technological companies, because all companies are now having to use digital technology to do something which tends to have this kind of structure. So agile, lean, all of these kind of things. Are they particularly effective? Only if they work out how to counter the traditional hierarchical controls. And I think that's the biggest challenge, because you don't want to be so decentralized that you have sort of no strategic component. It's just that flowing kind of thing. But you don't want that top-down model to interfere with all the possibilities that you have of having a decentralized model. So that's the tension that we're dealing with. It's the sort of pre-1980s industrial organization through the post-1980s post-industrial organization, and how do you meld those two together into a meaningful whole?
I've worked in all sizes of organizations, from global companies down to family-owned businesses. This is a really interesting topic, and you can't talk about this meaningfully without acknowledging that different people, different individuals have different sets of capabilities and tolerance for complexity and adaptability. So it's the interaction of the size, the scale, and the level of complexity with the individuals. And the simplistic stuff that I see that drives me mad is just simply saying big organizations bad, startup good, because as we now see, and I do a bit of work with growth companies, mainly in the tech space, guess what? When they hit a certain level of complexity, the people that were there from the startup period, actually some of them do struggle with this level of complexity. It's not the space that they feel comfortable in, so that it's not straightforward. And at that point, complexity, you need additional complexity in terms of systems and processes to enable growth. So what are the capabilities that you need then? So back to what Richard's point, small businesses have grown into large companies since we've been around. So this notion of how individuals actually build an appetite and a tolerance for complexity, some do and some don't. But I think it's simplistic to really just look at the organizational model without acknowledging that we're all wired differently in terms of our appetites as individuals and our understanding of, the various bits and pieces and how they fit together.
Yeah, I mean, we're in an interesting paradox at the moment. If you've got lots of these large companies trying to become more like a startup, and all the startups trying to become like a large company. Now, somewhere in the middle is the pragmatic solution of, all right, how do you deal with increased complexity at one level, and how do you decrease the complexity to an extent that you've got the ability to be a bit more nimble and fleet-footed if you're large, and it's that's the constant struggle. And I think we're all in that space, that pragmatic middle ground, going, well, I don't want to put in a model like this because that's not going to work for you, and I don't want to build you up like this because it's going to interfere with the way you like to work. But if you want to become more agile, you're going to have to do something, and if you want to grow, you're going to have to do something. It's working out what that looks like according to sort of the appropriateness of of your company. If it's not appropriate for your company, we won't do it. And then you're interestingly competing with all of these, what I would call clean consulting or shiny consulting models, where they just go, oh, this is your solution. It's this big digital playbook. Boom, you do that, things going to work.
So there's some interesting points there. Can I throw in a couple of provocations?
Go for it.
By all means.
So I think Richard, you made the comment that there's the pragmatic middle ground, and I'm very suspicious of the pragmatic middle ground. Right, I think that's where people want to be, but I'm not sure it's actually very large. And I think your point is actually a good one, that startups want to be big and big companies want to be small, right? And I think for most big companies, you're never going to be a startup, right? It's like me trying to be a ballerina, right? There are certain structural issues there that are going to stop that from happening, right? So I think with most large organizations, it's not how do you become a startup, but how do we become slightly more agile? And obviously, the whole thing around kind of lean startup, the stuff and the work of Steve Blank, in particular, before that, is basically saying you cannot take the traditional MBA you run a big corporation and apply it to a startup or a high growth small business. right? And I think there's something there about almost picking the, if we think of culture, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of suit because that implies something that is made, but perhaps hairstyle, because that is grown and shaped, but you don't have overall control over. And perhaps you need to choose a hairstyle that is appropriate to you, right? And I think a lot of the issues in terms of kind of cultural reorganization is there is no thought about, you know, what is the fit for the context of the organization and the nature of the organization. Things are just slapped on. We'll follow the Spotify model. We'll go agile. You know, we'll do holacracy. So I'm suspicious of the middle ground. I think we need to think about haircuts. I think the final point is actually around, so I think this is actually a golden opportunity, right? So if you look at organizational structures, right? So a lot of the organizational structure work came out of first the railroad companies and then the car companies in the US. Sorry to harp back on this, but these were the organizations that very much drove innovation in organizational structure, driven by their need to scale in a very particular way. Right? So therefore you had to have these hierarchical structures. You had to decompose jobs to actually get the level of scale you needed in either a transport network or manufacturing. Right? Now the way the startups operate is different. They have a different sort of needs they're trying to fulfill. And I think, so on the one hand, I think it's wonderful that they're all trying these organizational structures, right? And let's be blunt, most experiments end in failure, right? We should remember that. My only concern is, are we actually capturing all the data that we need to from those experiments? So there's a famous thing in epidemiology called the funnel plot, where you look at the results of research trials, and you typically find they're skewed positively, which means that people have underreported all the failures. Okay, you know, I think, do you get the idea? So my concern is a lot of the wonderful experimental work that people are spending VC money on, people are spending SoftBank's money on. Thank you, SoftBank, is that we're not actually capturing the results from it.
Yes, I would agree. There's not much money to be made in reporting that you've failed within academia, very much so, but also within organisational consultancy and the learnings from the failure. You've got to admit the failure first, and not many people are going to do that. I mean, my own research was from an organisational transformation that didn't necessarily fail, but was shifted into another form just towards the end. So it never succeeded, and we got from there to here. And talking about the interest in the pragmatic middle ground, and when we found the people that were most interesting, the ones that operated in the middle ground. So what you tended to find in lots of organisations, and certainly within the academic literature around the response to organisations. So within the innovation field, it's sort of Rogers' innovation curve, where at one end you've got the innovators, and at the other end you've got the laggards, and you've got this big group of in the middle. Now we actually found those people in the middle were the most interesting, because they hadn't jumped feet first in at the deep end of change. They weren't necessarily resisting it. They were trying to work out what was going on and trying to sense make potentially better ways of doing things as part of this process. So we what we found in the academic research was there's nothing about these people, and it's about 80% of us. 80% of us are constantly trying to work out what the hell's going on. And might be able to contribute, but aren't allowed to, because you're being seen as a resistor if you're not aligned with the cultural model and the transformational vision. So that's constantly informs my research. Is what is this pragmatic? And pragmatic might not be the right word. It's the one I come up with. So in the PhD we called it the third way. You're not committing, you're not resisting. It's a third way reaction to this environment, and it's most of us, and it's just a voice that's not listened to.
So back to what organizations reward, I mean, I would challenge all this talk about failure, because if you look at you know what is in demand is people who have breadth, depth, and a curiosity to learn, and well-established feedback mechanisms, so that you continue to learn right throughout your career. And there are characteristics around these learning agile individuals, and again, the research on this goes back decades, but we don't actually reward that openly in organizations. We don't encourage it. And there's some really interesting work that's been going on, you know, with a large global organization around completely upending their organizational development, their talent approach, to focus on learning agility. And it goes back to what Richard talked about, the sense-making capability combined with common sense. And in my experience, quite often these people aren't picked up in the high potential talent pool. So they're sitting right across organizations, as Richard says, just waiting to be asked. But they have a set of capabilities that that aren't overtly rewarded. So they're not, they're just sitting there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I know the research you're referring to, and I've read the academic research as well. So from memory, the learning agile people have 5 different components that you're looking for, which is mental agility and results agility, which are pretty easy to find. Have you got a good educational background? Have you achieved well in sort of these areas? Have you got experience in hitting results, etc.? But the other 3, which are people agility, can you talk well from different types of people and change your performance in relation to their character? Changeability is agility is can you change the way you act as a different world and expect it unfolds in front of you? And self-awareness is, are you understanding your own responsiveness to all of that? And I agree that we need to find people who can do all of those things if we are to create the kind of culture that's everyone's talked about for 40 years, where it is sort of much more participatory and people's voice gets heard, and they're not being found. And I think you're right that an awful lot of them do sit in that middle ground, saying this doesn't make sense. But because they've not been tapped on the shoulder at a young age and said, "Oh, you're one of these people who's going through these programs, and you're going to be you're hype," they just sort of sit there going, "This isn't something I understand, but I think I understand it better." But they've no voice, and none of that's being tapped into. And
and I think that's a really rich opportunity for organisations. And again, I know this is a particular interest of Richard's around employee engagement, but if you look at the sort of markers of current organizational performance, you know, really sluggish productivity, very low engagement, low trust levels, you know, what is it that we can actually do to engage people? People like to learn. I think, you know, we come at learning in a sort of workplace setting with the wrong sort of attitude. I think, you know, I've worked in many workplaces where people get excited about learning and trying new things and exploring, and, you know, so kids are like that. They start to go into the school system and they get it kicked out of them by the time they get to work. You know, they're well and truly just hanging on to their coffee mugs for life. But that's in all of us. And I'm sure we've all been in environments where there's something particularly gnarly, or, you know, the left field thing happens, and, you know, you think of the global financial crisis or a natural disaster. The stories that I've heard, for example, after the Christchurch earthquake, of Kiwi Bank basically chucking the rule book out so that people can design a way to work better, because they needed to actually work in a very different way. People know how to do this, and they're quite happy to adapt. So the stories that we tell ourselves about our workforce, I think, aren't rooted in reality.
I agree. I think that So there's so many people. We hire these educated and experienced people to do good work, and then we narrow them. And so I know one of Matt's questions is about sort of culture fit. They then get narrowed to fit a certain way of thinking and behaving, and it prevents them from bringing all of that into the workplace, because that's not, it's what they were hired for, but also not what they were hired for.
Yeah.
And again, we're stuck in that paradox, in that if you're not almost showing, if you're not impression management, if you're not doing the impression management work to show that you're aligned to the culture, and if you bring any of your professional or educational skills in and they conflict, then there's a challenge. But that's who we are. We're not cultural dupes. We are our professional history, we are our educational history, or our personal history, as well as the cultural stuff, and they all mix together, and that's where value lies, is working out, well, this person's not being an asshole, they just are saying something that they find meaningful, and they're trying to sense make the situation and say, this is how I think we need to act. And if you see that as resistance, then you're losing in possibility and potential. So in a real cultural sense, it's almost the idea that it's a sort of a late stage cultural development, where the organization, the ideology of the organization is suffering because of structural changes in the world. But because that ideology is a thing that, or the value system, or whatever you want to call it, that's the thing that leadership believes is what causes the high performance. Any response to the change the organization is going, it gets seen as resistance rather than as a contributing to a next level. So lots of organizations probably at inflection points where they're reaching this point where disengagement and low trust is rife, and they could collapse, or they could work their way through it and work out what that new form looks like, but not many have got there.
Yeah.
So I suppose I just want to riff off that last point. They could soar, they could collapse. Isn't the issue that most of them don't do either of those? They just kind of get stuck in a predicament, right? And life goes on and things happen, and they might not do stellarly well or atrociously badly, but life just goes on, right? And it's not until there's a major external shock from either, a new market entrant or some kind of economic issue, or a technological trigger or something like that. I think groups, organizations, polities can actually remain stuck for years.
Yeah, but not making a decision is a decision.
Mm-hmm. And it's a decision you can actually get away with for a surprisingly long period of time until you can't.
Yeah.
So that actually prompts a follow-on question, which I think we've touched on a bit already, but I just want to make it explicit, which is what changes cultures? That is, I haven't said who, but what changes cultures?
I think we've already talked about one or two of the answers. Increased complexity and the necessity of post-industrial forms of work as we move further and further into the digital revolution, for lots of companies at least. So one sort of informs the other. If you're moving into that digital space, you are increasing in complexity because the technologies are necessarily difficult to understand. So you might be managing someone who doesn't, and you don't understand the job they do. And that has a bunch of challenges that perhaps a leader and a manager didn't have 20 to 30 years ago. So that changes a culture. And so as we talk about digital transformation, digital transformation in itself is the change of organizational behaviors and human behaviors around digital technologies. So implementing new technology is going to change the culture massively.
Yeah.
So that for me, I think we're going into so I feel a bit Gilbert when I say paradigm shift, but I think we are going into a paradigm shift where we are seeing more and more people move away from seeing organizations as purely culture, and they're talking about them as complex adaptive systems. Now, whereas in the 70s they were talking about them as open systems, they're now talking about them as complex adaptive systems, and there is a difference. So I see some kind that also is going to change. It's going to change the culture. Just the shift, and I think we've got years to go before lots of organisations do it. But a couple of the organisations that I work with, they said, "Oh, you know, all our leaders are really interested in this complex adaptive systems stuff and the complexity science stuff. But when we throw that at them, they don't really understand it and they retreat." So we just need to we just need to nudge past that retreat. So I think that is changing a culture. I think technology is key to cultural change, always.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, I kind of agree with Richard. What you're talking about, maybe there's a set of external shocks, I would call them, and the rapid emergence and adoption of new technology is definitely one of those. And in a government context, for example, a new policy change, bang, a shock that's imposed that has these repercussions across the system. And I think there's a bunch of internal shocks that can positively and negatively affect the culture. And I think about, and in that external shock, I would add, you know, what Richard talked about before, the impact of mergers and acquisitions and, you know, ownership structure changes, which we know destroy value at a rate of gazillions, in spite of all the experience out there about how to do it better. I continue to hear stories around, you know, botched restructures, etc. But on the internal side, a change in the quality of leadership when, you know, a CEO who's been highly effective retires, leaves, moves on. How often do we see the domino effect of change at the top that then reshapes the culture in a positive or a negative way? Strategic decisions that, you know, are like betting the farm. Quite often these can have unintended consequences if they're poorly conceived, if they aren't explained well. Quite often they're not done well. So shoddy execution. And what I was talking about before, rapid growth, I think is a shock in itself. If organizations, if the leadership chooses not to decide, but sees the sort of, it's a pressure cooker environment in a rapid growth environment that will actually shift the culture whether or not they want it to. So there's a series of shocks that I think smart organizations actually start to anticipate these external and internal shocks as part of what Richard's talking about with this paradigm shift. And, you know, I know Black Swan's he's a Black Swan wrangler. I think that's the job of leadership, top leadership, is to actually spend 80% of their time scanning the horizon for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah,
do you think that's, Josie? I'm just going to ask a follow-up question to Josie quickly. Josie, do you think that's how they see their jobs? And if so, and if not, why not? And if not, what also can be done about that?
That's a really interesting question. I have met some really astounding leaders who do. They tend to have a set of characteristics. They're very focused. They're very super strategic thinkers. They're curious. They hire well. They hire people who are different from them, who again are adaptive thinkers, and you know, and so on and so on. They tend to be pretty rare. But, you know, back to what we were talking about before, those kinds of organizations tend to have distributed accountability, clear communication, a whole set of characteristics. Why don't more organizations do it? I think a lot of people in leadership roles actually have been advanced for the wrong reasons. And quite often this is due to the processes that elevate them. It's not just the individual. I've seen a lot of people dying 1,000 deaths in super complex roles that they weren't prepared for. You know, they weren't developed in the right way. They weren't given the sort of broad experience to set them up for success. And, you know, just inertia and success. If I look at Australian organisations, we've had it pretty good for a long time. So why change?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think Josie cheated in her answer to the question. You said what can change a culture, and she said leadership or leaders. That's a who, which is why I didn't go there. But as she brought it in, yeah, I think having a new leadership team in place or a new leader in place, so the CEO changes, or even a team, even a department leader changes. Very often, because of the reward systems that they get, there's this demand to do something different from the previous person incumbent, and you sort of okay, I'm gonna because if you just sit there and do nothing different, why are you there in the first place? So you have to act in a way that, and it might be the organisation is doing incredibly well, but because you're there to make a difference, you have to change it rather than just carry on. And that's one of the major challenges, is that people feel that they have to do something different in order to get the salary that they're being paid for. And that is not necessarily the case. I mean, sometimes, you said inertia, but sometimes just doing the same thing when the same thing is the right thing to do is also a good thing to do. But yeah, it's just as someone new comes in, then change is going to happen at some point around that person.
And if you think about, if you think about some of the big brands that have been around, the big corporations that have been around over time, I'm thinking of IBM and, you know, the GEs of the world, Unilever's, Cisco, you know, they've been around for many decades now. They go through this sort of cycle of maturity, decay, back to your, you know, what happens if they get to that point and they don't do anything. Yet they're still around. You know, there's not a huge number of them, but it'll be interesting, you know, in 10 years' time to look back at some of the darlings of the startup world to see, you know, are they around? You know, have they got that sort of longevity? You know, what is it around building a sustainable organization that they did or didn't do that they have in common with the IBMs and the Unilevers and those kinds of organizations that are still around? So
yeah, I think to go back to Matt's point about, so we talked about sort of inflection, you can soar or you can collapse, and Matt's point that you just carry on, and it's sort of this sludge of inertia and despair, and we're just going to carry on doing our own thing. Well, I think all three are possibilities. What might be happening now is the inert, sort of the carry on sludge. It just gets disrupted more quickly, or is at risk of being disrupted more quickly by these unknown players appearing on the horizon. You can look at how long companies stay in sort of the Fortune 500 and the various similar measurements around the world, and you can see that this is happening. That you don't stay at the top as long as you did 100 years ago. So whilst yes, I think a lot of companies, and certainly in an industry where you're not necessarily at risk of disruption, or it's not something that the disruptive players have had a focus on, you can stay there for a long time and just carry on as is. But you know, you're already beginning to see the banks get worried about the digital players. You know, the experience. You know that it's beginning to happen there as well. And if it can happen to the banks, then all you need to see is one of the big banks start to crumble, and we're going to be in a very interesting situation very quickly. Now the question then is, are the banks too big to fail? And do we end up in sort of the socialized risk situation where the public bails out of one of the big banks, as happened in 2008, and they just carry on anyway? So you've got all of these dynamics that you have to take into account too.
Okay, we're sort of coming up to 1/4 past the hour, so I think we're about 45 minutes in. Okay, so I'm saving the final question until the end. Do either of you have anything you wish to offer up, or thoughts that crop into your head, or things that we haven't talked about so far that you think need to be discussed? I mean, obviously there's heaps, but things that are burning in you that you think need to be discussed.
I like the question that you gave us in our notes, which is, what are the most obvious indicators of the kind of culture an organisation has?
Excellent.
I've been chatting to I really it's the things that I try and do, ethnographical observations and listening to stories, which is roughly the same thing. But you're looking for water cooler stories. So in Dave Snowden's terms, it's the stories the raw data that people tell when they don't think management's listening. So you're looking at stories people tell around water coolers, or in the liminal space, or over a beer or a coffee together. Now, if you can do that at scale, so if you can actually find out what everybody's thinking and across the whole organisation rapidly, then you can map very, very quickly what the various thinking is, and begin to work out where to intervene. So listening to stories, either in a safe environment, a liminal space for me. There's also, there's the classic thing that I used to be able to do, which I can't anymore because everyone's gone open plan and clean desk policy, which was look for Dilbert cartoons.
Yes.
So if you went to an organisation and they had some Dilbert cartoons on the walls, you sort of went, oh, this is probably quite a nice place to work. If they had lots of Dilbert cartoons, you probably thought, this is a bit shitty. If they had 0 Dilbert cartoons, you'd recognise what a disastrous place that was going to be, because everything was going to get stripped off the wall and no political commentary was allowed. Or the state of toilets. Was the company's toilet? What's the state of the company's toilets? Because if they're shit, then that tells you an awful lot about what the company's culture is like. They don't really care about people. And finally, for me, diversity and inclusion observations. I don't want to talk about what they think their diversity and inclusion is. I want to have a look. Is it obvious that different types and people have got the space to be part of this organisation? One of the classic piece that I've seen is an organisation that talked about being one of the most diverse and inclusive organisations in America. And then they had a company photograph in the headquarters, and everybody was between the ages of 25 and 35 and white. And when it was just, so you want to just go and have a look and see if there are different types of people there. Because the reason I say that is I think an organisation that's rapidly scaling, that really struggles to deal with diversity and inclusion, culture becomes the thing that they try to use to keep a toxic organisation together. Oh, it doesn't matter that the job is shit, because at the end we all have Nerf gun fights and get pissed together, and we're all very similar types of people, and we can so. If they talk about diversity and inclusion, and yet you look at them and you go, you're not, that for me is like it's one of the biggest red flags that you can see in an organisation. You very often have to go to the headquarters to do a proper observation of this, but that would stick right out for me.
I'm absolutely aligned with Richard. You just notice the gaps between what that plaque on the wall says and how people actually behave towards each other. And to me, the language and behaviours is, it's all relational. It's not just about work. So are people civil? We have terrible mental health issues in workplaces, in particular industries, at the moment. And, people behaving in a way that they wouldn't behave outside work, that's tacitly allowed. So, and that leads to more toxic behaviours. Again, it's Richard's specialty, but, how gossip and all those sorts of flags to me, how people treat each other is one thing. My other particular bugbear is the purpose card and purpose washing, which is purpose is the catch-all for a whole lot of things now. You know, that people will join an organization for a purpose and stay is simplifying a very complex proposition, which is people are motivated by a whole range of things, including status, including money, including competition, including their lived experience at that particular moment. And so, you know, the purpose is being held as the flag, the answer to a lot of things. And it's really like putting wallpaper on a cracked wall in a lot of organizations.
I would go further. I think institutional purpose scares me more than almost anything. It hasn't got a good history. An institution deciding what the greater good is.
Yeah.
It does not have a good history. And historically, the sort of studies in this area, the level of toxic behaviours and awful behaviours in an institution that believes it's serving the greater good are just horrific, because you can justify the bad behaviour because you're serving the greater good. So for that to become the informing element of institutional cultures, because it really is, it's sort of a purpose-based culture, is the way that they're framing themselves now. I find that potentially really horrifying.
So I'm just going to drop in an observation. So I'm very interested in organisations that give themselves away unintentionally. So a few years ago, I had a job where I had to go around lots of call centres, right? And the first thing you notice when you go into a call centre is how bright everything is. Yes, it's mostly oatmeal and beige kind of, you know, dividers and that kind of cubicle farms and that kind of thing. But there's always lots of cartoons on the walls and lots of awards. And there's pictures of people out, you know, kind of like on the monthly social and this kind of thing. And, you know, and it all looks very cheerful. Then you think about it for 5 minutes and you realise that most of this stuff is there because from an emotional labour perspective, the job is horrendous, right? Mm. You're spending a lot of your time either dealing with people's complaints, right, and being the brunt of their frustration, or trying to sell people things they fundamentally don't want. Right, so hence the need to kind of jolly things up in the environment. So if ever I come across somewhere that looks like that, I immediately get a little bit suspicious. One thing I actually want to bring in is the role of machines in all this. Right, so I for one welcome our new robot overlords and pledge my eternal allegiance to them. But So if some of the things that people are talking about with AI happen, what will that do for organisational cultures?
I think there's two answers. So it depends on if AI is automating jobs or augmenting people. So if it's all automating the jobs and doesn't augment people, yeah, not very good, because there's not going to be many jobs left.
But that's great, isn't it? We go off and we go off and act like, you know, Renaissance aristocrats, surely.
Well, yeah, if we can work out how to fund everything, yes, that would be a perfect solution. But if it automates jobs and augments people, so you sort of it takes away all of the stuff that causes frustration, and then augments you, so you're more civil and you're more creative and you use your critical intelligence more and then you become more flexible in your thinking and all of these kind of things. If it can help us do that, then it's going to be great. So that's the way that I don't know. I think we can go in either direction. We can go totally automated and no augmentation, and it's going to be horrible because we're just going to get sort of. I mean, the jobs, the few jobs that are going to be available are the ones that the machines can't do, and they're just filling in the gaps between the machine work. If it augments our lives, then potentially we have a wonderful future. I feel Star Trek is at its peak is on the horizon.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I've been interviewing futurists and technologists for 30 years in some shape or form, and
you have my sympathy, Josie.
I love it. I have a lot of friends who read fantasy and sci-fi, and I must say I read a lot of the research around job losses, and I think the smart person would cut it in half and divide by 1,000, 1,000,000, and wait to see what's actually emerging and navigate it that way. And the smart leaders that I've seen don't bet the farm on stuff that's still emerging. Back to Richard's point about the paradigm shift, we don't actually know what the future is going to look like. And I think it would be reckless on the part of shareholders and workers to jump wholesale into a whole bunch of stuff. The other point that I would make around that is humans have shown an amazing capacity through history to navigate turbulence and change, and Richard's research would support this. And I think part of this is we should be thinking about work in a very different way. So when we talk about automating tasks, yes, the robots are going to take some of those yucky tasks away, and that might impact on whole jobs. But, you know, if we just talk wholesale about jobs going, we're missing the fine layers that work is going to contain a multitude of things, including some tasks that will be automated. And we are resourceful enough as humans so far to create work that fits as this new world emerges. So I'm actually, you know, an optimist around all of this, around our capacity to navigate it.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. So I'm just going to throw in a quick observation, which is I think one of the problems with our AI is it's too human. Right, a lot of the training data that goes into it is from human beings, and we know that human beings are racist, they're sexist, they're quite unpleasant, right? and therefore, kind of our machines are too like us, and that's the problem. They often copy our worst behaviours. I think the point about augmenting rather than simply automating is really well made, and I completely agree with that. And that's certainly the future I would like to see. There's a wonderful thing called centaur chess, which is where you partner a human being with a machine, and they turn into an awesome chess playing combination. So I'm thinking about the idea of centaur workers here potentially, and also again, I think there's a dream, especially amongst some technologists, that middle managers do nothing, and if only the senior leadership had direct access to the frontline workforce, everything would go swimmingly. And I think that is an illusion I would love to see punctured by reality. But let's see what happens there.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So I'm going to throw down the last question. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful experience. I've learned a lot. I feel privileged to be in the same virtual space as both of you. So, okay, so what can people do? You know, whether you're a leader or whether you're just a manager or just a frontline worker or just somebody in an organization, what can you do about culture? Assuming you're not a CEO.
Okay. So my favorite piece of favorite review of my work probably last year, and Bruce Daisley, who's VP for Twitter in EMEA, I think, sort of pushed my work ahead in the front of the Rob Briner, who runs a Centre for Evidence-Based Management. And so he basically said to Rob, one of the things I've been told, if you've got a values-based culture, so you see your 6 values on the wall, and he says the only possible response from anyone is an ironic one, because anyone with a brain goes, values reality gap. So for me, the key thing, and this is, first of all, you know there's going to be a gap, so don't get upset when you see it. It's inevitable. So if you're not going to get upset, what can you do? Well, you can laugh at it.
So what you're saying there is don't believe the hype.
Yeah, don't believe the hype. So an appropriate level of cynicism, but I don't want it to be like toxic cynicism. You know, it's the critical element of cynicism. So you see the gap. Instead of becoming upset by it, which is what the cynic would potentially do, you find it amusing. You learn to laugh at the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And by learning to laugh at the gap between the rhetoric and reality, you can develop all kinds of different tactics and techniques to socially bond with other people who are seeing the same thing, to play around backstage with how to potentially solve some of these things while still presenting the appropriate front stage audience. So you end up becoming a very sophisticated version of the self, where you're playing multiple roles simultaneously whilst you're trying to survive long term in this, but you're enjoying it at the same time. And as long as you can get that joy, then you can start doing stuff that's quite interesting, and you'll bond with other people who see that you're doing it, because lots of people do think this way. That's how I would begin to approach it. And then any opportunity you have to go to an interesting collaborative session, both inside or outside your organization, go to, because you might meet other people in different organizations, and you might get opportunities to move on and elsewhere.
Richard stole all of my thunder, so I'm just going to rephrase what he said in my words. But I'll start with what he finished on, which is staying curious and playful, you know, is so critical, because in any organization now, the responsibility for making work meaningful starts with us. But our job is not to fix the unfixable, for the reasons that we've talked about. A culture is whatever a culture is. But you can have impact if you watch, if you use language with care and civility, if you watch your own behaviours and don't allow yourself to be drawn into whatever the prevailing behaviours are, you can have an impact one-to-one, and go about your business, and you never do it alone. And to finish with what Richard talked about, there are always cool people, there are always interesting people around you if you take the time. And when I'm working with people and the subject of transformation comes up, you know, how do we do it? And I say, go and find someone interesting, buy them a coffee, and see if there's something you might do together. That's how you make work meaningful. We spend a lot of hours of the day doing it. So why not do it with people that challenge you and you can have fun with?
Josie, that is wonderful advice. That is gorgeous. And I feel I've been in that very situation this evening with the two of you. Thank you so much for your time. Josie Gibson, Richard Claydon, you've been awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
Now I'm just going to stop the recording.
And that's a wrap.
He's still recording. I can see the red button.
Oh, okay.